Welcome to another episode of the Dentology podcast, where we discuss the business of dentistry. In this podcast series, we'll be discussing all the non-clinical aspects of dentistry, from Goodwill values, finance, marketing, how to buy and sell a dental practice mindset, through to where you can invest your money in team management issues. My name is Andy Acton, and I'm joined by my co-host, Chris Strevens. Let's jump straight into it. Hello and welcome to another episode of Dentology, the Business of Dentistry podcast. And this morning we're joined by David Brewer, the Managing Director of FTA Finance. How are you, David?
I'm very well, Andy. Thank you. Good to see you both.
Yeah, good morning, David.
And this morning, David's going to be talking to us about all things involved with buying a dental practice. David's our finance guru. He's the UK finance guru for dentists looking to arrange finance. So it's going to be a really interesting chat to see where we go and the things that dentists can learn if they're looking to arrange finance. Just to start, David, could you perhaps just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background? It'd be quite useful to know that.
Of course, yeah, no problems at all. My background is banking primarily. I was 24 years at one of the major high street banks. The last 12 of those years, I was a specialist healthcare manager, where primarily I was arranging finance for dentists to buy dental practices. I left the bank in 2010, so best part of 11 years ago now. And I more or less do the same role. I'm now Director FTA Finance, and my role is to help dentists buy dental practices. So very much what I did at the bank. So best part of 20 years experience of working with dentists of all shapes and sizes, and probably have helped over 2,000 dentists over those past 20 years set up in practice.
I reckon you might be the one who's done the most dental lending for anyone, actually. If you think with that history, David, I'd have thought you probably are the most experienced financer of dental practices in the UK.
Wouldn't surprise me at all. Just before we get into things, David, something occurred to me. So you left the bank in 2010, which was coming out the back of the last recession, which kind of hit the UK towards the end of 2008. So what's your comparison like between that recession of 2008, 2009, and in part into 2010, and the COVID pandemic? How do they compare, and how did it affect dentistry, and what was the availability of funds, and how did banks react differently across those two issues?
Yeah, the response is actually quite different. Back in 2009, 2010, it was grim. The banks more or less closed their wallets. We went from the best part of 10 banks lending to the profession down to one or two. And even those one or two were very stringent in terms of what they would make available.
Wow.
This time around, very different. Obviously, we've not quite come out of the pandemic yet. And following the initial shutdown, so March to June last year, which did affect dental practices with the vast majority of them having to close, most reopened immediately in June. And most have bounced back very, very well and actually are trading above pre-pandemic levels. The beauty is the banks know this, and they know how safe and secure the dental profession has been historically, and they are really pleased at how quickly they bounce back. So this time round, there has been no change to the lending stance. The banks are still lending. The pricing is still reasonable. So I would like to think we're in a very different position now to where we were back in 2009, 2010.
So no major policy changes, David?
There have been some tweaks and some changes. A couple of banks made knee-jerk reactions middle of last year. So June to October, a couple of the banks did change their lending stance, but they've now gone back to more or less to where they were pre-pandemic.
Has anyone left the market?
As a result of the pandemic, no. There were a couple of banks that had pulled out of the market before the pandemic struck. Mm-hmm. With the banks, it is pot luck in terms of the managers you go to. The beauty with dental lending and healthcare lending, it isn't credit scored. So it comes down to individual interpretation of both the bank manager and in turn the lending underwriter. So I know I can put the same proposal to two managers at the same bank and get a completely different decision.
So manager's really important.
Oh, goodness gracious. The individual manager and the individual relationship is key. Rest assured, we know the people to go to and the banks to go to. For a customer to arrange this off their own back, for them, it really is potluck.
So on that point, David, if I'm thinking of buying a dental practice, where do I start? What do I do? What's the chronology? How do I approach it?
In terms of starting, right at the very, very beginning, talk to your family. Before you go anywhere near a bank or come anywhere near me, talk to your family and friends. Not everybody is cut out for practice ownership.
Oh, I thought talk to your family and friends for the money. I thought you were talking about for the money, not making sure you're the right sort of person.
Bank of mum and dad, yes, please. Low interest rates. Never
absolutely.
Pay it back.
Bank of mum and dad does come into play quite often. So, yes, certainly speak to them on that side. But also, they hopefully will be the most truthful in terms of your managerial experience, capacity, and actually your ability to take over a business.
That's
because not everybody is cut out for it.
That's good advice.
Leading on from that, obviously, assuming family give you the thumbs up, compile a wish list. What would be your perfect practice? And I'd normally suggest 10 items on that list. Location, normally top of the list. So, where do you want that practice to be? How big do you want that practice to be? So how many surgeries? Are you looking for NHS, private, mixed? Any particular specialisms? How many staff are you looking for? So come up with what would be your desired practice. So when you ultimately register with agents and start getting details of businesses coming through, you can compare those to your wish list. And
that wish list, I guess people can be quite broad in their range of what they want. Is there, I guess location is top of the tree and critical, but is there a point at which when you work down that wish list, you kind of have to stop and say it's good enough? Is there a danger that you're looking for this ideal practice that just might not be out there?
Yeah, the ideal practice is out there, but the ideal practice is what everybody wants to buy. So the ideal practice is likely to be quite expensive. It comes down to supply and demand. The word I always use, it's not a very nice word, but if you want to practice at a reasonable price and to get on that ladder, it's compromise. Right. You may need to compromise with your wish list. You may need to compromise on the location. You may need to compromise on the size of the practice.
The same as house buying, really, where people say, I want to buy a 5-bed house in this road. And the answer is there's not a 5-bed house in this road, but there could well be a 4-bed house that you might be able to extend and do something with. So, yeah, so don't be quite so bullet focused, maybe. Consider your options and what you will compromise on.
Yeah, it's a case of being flexible. And whilst the practice you end up buying may not be your perfect practice now, you will ultimately turn it into your perfect practice over the years.
And I guess within that shopping list, that wish list of things that are practice, the size, the number of surgeries is going to come into play. And I guess when you start building your profile, that's going to come up with a typical practice that's going to have an average value attributed to it. So then it comes down to the borrowing. So how much can a dentist borrow? How much do they need by way of a deposit? What does that look like at the moment?
The response to that is it varies, and it depends. It depends on your circumstances. It depends on the bank in question. I still see a lot of quite misleading adverts out there talking about 100% finance. And obviously for most first-time buyers, people see 100% and they think that the bank's going to lend them absolutely everything with no commitment or contribution. It is very, very rare for a bank to lend 100%. So in most cases, you would need to budget for a cash contribution. I would suggest somewhere between 10 and 20% of the Goodwill figure.
That's good to know.
Freehold is different. If the premises are free, if the practice is in freehold premises, you may well get 100% finance on that element.
Oh, wow.
But for Goodwill, budget between 10 and 20% cash. There may be a few ways around that if you've got a fairly healthy property portfolio with quite sizable equity within the respective properties. the cash contribution may come down and property comes in as additional contribution.
Right.
But
So
for me,
that
still
added
not 100%.
security, or possibly if you've got another practice, is that where people start talking about 100% finance when there's other assets in the background?
Correct. And for me, that isn't technically 100% finance, because you're still putting something towards the purchase, not necessarily cash, but a physical asset, be it property or maybe an existing practice that you own already.
And for people listening to this, David, I assume we're just saying then that all banks have different policies for percentages. So some people would only lend 30% or 10%. Is that right? So you end up with yet again, you've got a different bank with a different policy that might have a different deposit and a different interest rate. So don't just think that all banks are the same.
You're spot on. We currently have 14 high street banks, or names that you would recognise.
14?
14, 1-4, that we can potentially
name 14 banks, David.
I could go through the list, but it will become quite boring on this. But in addition to those 14, there are smaller niche providers who are now starting to pop up as well. Probably not quite there for the really big purchases, but maybe for smaller purchases, they're now starting to come into play.
Wow.
Now, as you say, all of these banks are different. They all look for different types of purchaser. They all want different types of contribution, different types of experience as well. And just to add to the fun, their criteria is ever changing, because they're constantly flexing their criteria. And as I indicated earlier, you go to the same bank with two different people at that bank, you're going to get different decisions, which is where the role of the broker, this is where I really come into play. We know the banks to approach who you would fit their criteria quite neatly. We know the managers to approach, and most importantly, we know how to approach them. We will be compiling business plans, forecasts to really make it as easy as possible for that bank to say yes.
Wow. It's interesting, isn't it? Because I'm not a great mathematician. I'm quite good with numbers, but not a mathematician. But it would be interesting if you worked out the probability of rocking up to one bank with one manager and getting a really good deal. When you look at, as you were saying, there's 14 banks, there's differing credit policies, there's differing managers within those banks, to actually end up and going, I've hit a right star here, is probably pretty rare, I'd have thought. And the danger then, I suppose, is you end up either getting rejected, not because the deal was bad, but because the bank won't lend to it, or you end up overpaying, I suppose, David. I mean, have you seen that, where people have ended up paying more than they should have done because they didn't necessarily go to the right person?
Yeah, well, I've got two examples I could use there. One is an associate, a first-time buyer, who approached us along the lines of, look, I want to buy a practice, but I don't think I can. He'd spent the last 3 years looking and offering on businesses, but he kept going back to his own bank. And his own bank was saying no to every proposal he put forward. So he never got any further forward. I received the details from this particular customer, and I couldn't see the problem. It's a relatively straightforward applicant. And the next practice he looked at, I got him to send me the details, and within 24 hours, we had a bank offer for him.
God, that's remarkable.
The problem wasn't him or the practice. The problem was the bank.
But the problem is, if you don't know that, and you then trust the individual, and they're giving you an answer based on the policy of the bank they work for, they're not lying. They're telling the truth. They can't do it. But that doesn't mean the deal's not doable. It just means for that manager in that bank, it's not doable. But I guess you found a bank that was more than willing to do that business.
Oh, well, we had 2 or 3 banks that would lend on it, and this poor purchaser, this poor associate, had put his life on hold for 3 years.
Yes, he'd lost opportunities for 3 years.
Yeah, because he didn't fit the lending criteria of the bank that he went to, but that bank wouldn't tell him that. All they would say is, no, not this practice. Wow. Very sad. Very sad. Second example as well of customers who had come to us, they could go to their own bank, they could strike lucky, they could get it approved. But the banks, bear in mind, they're a business, and the task of the bank manager is normally to get the best return for the bank. So quite often, if they go direct, the terms and the rates of interest are quite high. Now, we know what the average pricing should be. we also know how far we can potentially push a bank and a bank manager on the pricing, and we do the negotiating. We've had cases where customers have got terms, but the terms were at 5 or 6% over base, and we managed to secure terms at 2.75 over.
Wow, that's a massive amount over a long-term loan, isn't it? I mean, that's just like ridiculous.
Yeah, I think on this case, the difference was about £20,000 a year in terms of additional costs.
What in loan repayments? £20,000 a year in saving.
Wow.
And multiply that by the length of the loan. Again, quite an extreme example.
Oh, yeah, sure. But it makes the point, though, doesn't it? Because even at a smaller local level, you still could be talking hundreds of pounds a month being saved.
Yeah. Wow. That's a huge difference now, because not only does that improve how much money you've got to spend, personally, but also it reduces the term of your indebtedness, doesn't it? If you sort of turn that into, instead of a 15-year loan, it then becomes a 12-year loan or whatever. That's a massive change.
You were saying, David, about the way you approach banks and the way that you go about it. Do you find there are a number of people who would try to arrange a loan themselves, it not go well, and then come to you? And if you do have those people, does that make your job significantly more difficult than it would be? Because I'm just thinking, if a loan's already been declined, trying to then get that flipped to an approval, is that challenging, and can it be done?
It's a challenge. Once a bank and a credit underwriter has made a lending decision, it is very difficult to overturn that decision, even if you go back with more compelling evidence, a more detailed business plan, forecast cash flow, just because the bank and the lender in question doesn't like to be seen to be backtracking.
Right, yeah.
So my mantra is get it right first time. Get it right first time. And even if you are doing it yourself, make sure you go to the bank prepared. Because if you go to the bank without all of the background information, without forecasts, without a detailed business plan, at best you're likely to be, at best you're going to get poor terms, but more likely it's going to be rejected.
Well, what's your sort of submissions of your percentage of success when you put something up? What's that sort of turn into?
It's good and it's consistent. We know that when we put a case forward, the vast majority of times it's going to be agreed. 94% of the proposals that we submit to the banks are approved. So it's a high percentage, and that's our, we pride ourselves on that stat. Of the 6% that we don't get, it's normally because our dear customer hasn't declared certain bits of information.
Right.
That's where it does fall down slightly, but 94% of what we put to the lenders will be and has been historically approved.
And I suppose in reality, you probably don't want a 100% hit rate, because the danger is that means that you're only putting through sure bets, and there's going to be those ones on the fringe that could or could not be approved. So therefore, you've got to try them. I know that obviously there's the client, as you're saying, might not have told you on their credit reference or something. But I think that's good, isn't it? Because actually, you wouldn't really want 100%, because that sort of says almost we're only going to touch dead sure deals, whereas actually there probably are some that are, depending on how they're presented, will depend on whether they get an approval or not.
I agree. We are, and me and my team, we are masters at, let's say, polishing up cases to present them in the most practical manner.
Yeah, I was worried where you were going with that one, David.
And bizarrely, we would also, the same case, we would also structure slightly differently depending on the lender. As well, we could say, we end up sometimes with 2 or 3 separate proposals, but for the same case, knowing that banks like to look at different things and like certain aspects.
And typically for a deal that you put to a bank to arrange finance, what would that package comprise of? What would be in that package that you would present to the bank?
To start off with, I need to gather information. So I will be looking for information and background on the applicant, so the purchaser, so the basics, asset and liability profile, bank statements, how they conduct their accounts, their prior earnings. The most important document from the customer, though, for me, is their CV. Very underrated document, the CV, and in most cases, I need to get my customers to rewrite it, because their CVs are wonderful clinically, but I need them to big up and expand upon their managerial experience so we can help adapt the CV into a more bank-friendly format.
And I'm guessing that lots of the people that are applying for finance are currently associates looking to step into that role of principal. And are they not particularly good at evidence in their business experience? Because in my experience, lots of associates actually do contribute to perhaps the marketing, or they may deputise to the principal when they're on holiday, or they may provide some mentoring to other people in the practice. But I don't often see them seeing that as something they're doing and they get recorded anywhere. Is that kind of what comes over in CVs as well?
You're absolutely spot on. When I talk about managerial experience to first-time buyers, most of them immediately say, we haven't got any. But the reality is, in their day-to-day job, going back over the past 2 or 3 years, they will have done quite a lot in terms of covering, if the principal is off, helping with maybe with a CQC inspection, possibly helping with staff interviews as well. Also, a lot of the customers we deal with, the family members, be it mum, dad, brother, sister, are self-employed. They own and run their own businesses, not necessarily dental, but there is a history of business ownership within the family, and that's really important. I would include that within the CV as well.
Oh, that's interesting.
You've got family to lean upon if needs be.
So you've got experience, even though it might not be your experience. You've got a shared experience you can draw upon. Oh, that's interesting.
So on the individual side, it's quite comprehensive. That is a significant part of what you're proposing to the banks is the individual. And in that case, the bit that goes with that is the proposal of the target practice that's being acquired as well.
Oh, indeed. Yeah, that's the next step. As the applicant key, but also what are you buying? And in terms of what you're buying, before we even go near the bank, we need to work out whether it is a viable proposal, both in terms of the asking price and the affordability. So the first thing we would do before we go anywhere near a lender is to undertake an affordability assessment. So we would prepare a profit and loss forecast based on how our customer is going to run the business. We would build in additional costs as well, and quite often the loan costs, we'll need to put those in there, and just to see what money is left at the end of the day, to ask the question, is it worth it?
So on the affordability side of things, you were saying that you got a loan approval of 94%. So might there be some cases that you wouldn't even put forward to banks and have a very honest conversation with a prospective buyer to say, look, this just isn't going to work? So even before it got to the banks, you would effectively go no further, because based on your experience, you just don't think that's right for them, either on affordability or the skills they've got, or it being too expensive, or whatever the other reasons might be.
Yeah, at the end of the day, our duty is to the purchaser, the customer. And if we truly believe hand on heart, they're going to be much worse off as a result. And also, if we know hand on heart, it's not going to be approved by the banks.
Yeah,
we will explain the reasons why to the applicant. And it's quite often a very difficult discussion, because they've got their heart set on this particular business.
It's a big deal, isn't it? I mean, buying a business, most people are only going to do that once, possibly twice in their life, and you're effectively saying to them, no, not yet.
Especially if they ticked a lot of those points on David's wish list.
Yeah.
Sure. So as I say, whilst it is a difficult conversation, once we've explained the reasons why, most of the time it is accepted. And 2 weeks later, the customers come back with another practice that they like to purchase. This again ticks all the boxes, and this one's affordable. So away we go.
It's a very ethical and fair thing to do, because what you're doing is you're preventing a potential future failure or a problem, or putting them in a really risky financial position.
It must help also, David, does it, when you're submitting to the banks, because they know that you've sort of done a very thorough, almost like a pre-application before you then submit it. So therefore, does that then, do you think, give you a sort of, I don't mean the word priority, but to a certain degree, they will review your deals because they know you've already done some pre-assessment, rather than just like got a big bundle of electronic papers and shoved them down the line to
Yes, I would use the word priority, actually, because we've heard this from a number of the major banks to whom we refer. They've indicated we are the biggest introducer of dental business to them, and they always remark upon the quality and the strength of the application. And that's not just from the manager, that's coming from the credit team as well. So
wow, that's brilliant.
Yes, they are much more likely to look favourably upon a referral from our good selves just because of our track record.
And you don't want to ruin that by sending up a couple of duffers, do you?
Oh, no. No. Well, that's the reputation thing,
that's
isn't
right.
it? You work hard to build
You spend years gaining it and then minutes losing it.
And also the customer's reputation as well. You know, if we put a case forward and we know hand on heart is not going to be approved, that's on the record against that customer at that bank. And that's the last thing we want. You know, the customer goes back, you know, in a year's time, there would still be a record of that original application. We want to avoid that.
That's a really interesting point, actually, David. I never really thought about that. That's a bit like almost when someone gets a county court judgment on their credit record and then wonders why they can't borrow something because they never paid their phone bill when they moved. And I hadn't really thought about that fact that if you do it yourself and sort of make a bit of a hash of it potentially and get it declined, when you then go back again, they then look back and say, oh, it was declined before. So therefore, there's got to be something negative about it, even if it was just that the submission itself was negative.
Yeah, I think it was Ronnie Barker.
That is interesting.
I think Ronnie Barker said, you know, reputation is your own currency, spend it wisely, which I think is lovely, and it's true because...
And serious for Ronnie Barker.
I was going to say, yeah, he wasn't known for his serious words, but he used that one, which was quite sweet. So you've assembled all the things that you need, and then it goes to the bank. Timeline. What does that timeline look like from talking to you to getting to a stage where a loan's approved? How long does that process take?
The first part of the process is actually quite swift. From an initial discussion with the customer, assuming they send me all the information I need, I would expect to have an indicative bank responses within 48 hours. So it's a very quick response.
Wow, that's impressive.
It's not credit backed at that stage, but these are the thoughts of the manager. These are the terms, and we only go to the experienced managers. So 9 times out of 10, we know their underwriters are going to back them up once it goes to the next stage.
Right. So that 48-hour window, you're saying that after that period, 90% of those are more than likely going to follow through, just because of the relationship you've got with those experienced managers. So that's brilliant from a confidence point of view for a buyer, because obviously if you're buying a practice, arranging finance is part of it, but you start incurring other costs as well. You know, you're engaging lawyers and valuations and things, and you really want to be kind of making those payments reasonably confident that you're going to get the money for the deal to happen.
Absolutely spot on, yeah. And at that stage, at that early stage, we would have effectively a term sheet, or probably 2 or 3 of them from the various lenders, which could be used by the buyer to show to the sales agent or to the vendor, if it's a private sale, to give them the confidence that they've got the backing of the bank behind them. After that stage, it's then normally a week before we've got the full credit back terms. We then move into the realms of valuations, which again can take another couple of weeks. And then we hand over to lawyers, where it can take a little bit longer. But realistically, from beginning to end, 6 months is a typical transaction timeline, which is longer than I would like it to be. Yeah. But that's average. We've got some that are 3 months and some that are...
I think the thing for me, though, is you get confidence early. After 48 hours, you know, I know that would all work out, but at that point, from a finance point of view, you're well on track, and you're more than likely going to know if you've got a bank who's going to be backing you.
Oh, definitely. It's getting that offer accepted, giving them the confidence to go ahead, put down a holding deposit, instruct the solicitors, and then take it forward from there. And actually, I've said it a few times, the easiest part of my job is actually getting the loan agreed.
Right.
It's everything that happens after then, between you shaking hands with the vendor and accepting your offer to when the loan completes in 6 or 9 months' time. I think we've worked out there are about 25 or 26 variables that could come into play that could possibly derail a purchase. But we know what to look out for, so we keep it on track.
I was going to say, I suppose in a way it's a bit like a complicated endo referral in a way from a dentist point of view. You know, a complicated endo referral, you may well be able to do it yourself, but the chances of getting a success and a competent one that doesn't blow up, you would use an endo specialist, but it does cost you a bit more money. But the circumstances are that you'll actually get a result rather than potentially a failure.
Yeah.
That's a great comparison. And again, I would like to think with our involvement, we do actually speed up the process. Again, I know I probably annoy quite a few of the lawyers out there because we are constantly on their back. In a very polite way, I would add, in just chivying the case along, trying to find out where the delay is, and removing any blockages to ensure the purchase progresses as smoothly as possible.
But I think, as Andy said, I think there's a positive, isn't it? The fact of, if you can get a positive within 48 hours, but also if you get a negative that maybe not from the credit, but from you guys, it also then stops it sort of. The danger is it gathers momentum, doesn't it? And then suddenly, they're getting really excited. They do their own application, and then the bank comes back 2.5 weeks later with a no. It's disappointing for the buyer. It's probably disappointing for the seller.
That bubble gets bigger and bigger, and at some point it's going to pop.
You get a chance to
don't know that.
You get a chance from what you assess to actually say to someone, the honest answer, I don't think it's going to work.
Yeah.
Right quickly, so as you not sort of spend 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks getting really excited and then getting your bubble deflated. I think it's fascinating.
At the beginning, David, you were saying about COVID, and we were talking about the comparison between a recession and COVID. Where does dentistry sit in terms of the bank's view of the sector? Is it a sector that they're really well disposed to and they're keen to lend more money? Is it kind of mid-tier? I guess it's not down at the pubs and restaurants end of the market because they've not had a good time. But where does it kind of sit on that line?
You'll be pleased to know very high. The banks quite often adopt a traffic light system, red, amber and green. Obviously, green is go, and for most of the lenders, dental remains green. As a sector they're comfortable with, a sector where they have very, very few bad debts. And this is going back 20 or 30 years. The number of bad debts, if it relates purely to dentistry, is very, very low indeed when compared with other professions. And as a consequence, the banks are more than happy to lend against goodwill, which they won't. For hardly any other professions would you get any borrowing against goodwill. You will in dentistry, and the banks are very comfortable lending against leasehold as well. So a lot of the practices we see are in leasehold premises, 15-year lease. Again, other sectors getting a loan against that is very difficult, but the bank would not have a problem as long as the lease is of a reasonable length. So in an ideal world, if you're buying, that lease should be 15 years because any loan is linked to the length of the lease.
I presume that 15 years just means that they spread the term of the repayments over 15 years. Is that right? So you could have a shorter lease, but it just means that it reduces the amount of repayments that you get, so potentially pushes your repayment cost up. Is that right?
Yeah, for the vast majority of the banks, they will link the loan to the length of the lease. So if it's a 7-year loan, the repayments are going to be more than twice as high as if it were a 15-year lease and a 15-year loan. There's one or two exceptions, but the vast majority of the lenders would be looking for a lease, ideally 15 years.
That's been really interesting. There's been loads of gems in there in terms of not just what you do, the how to arrange finance, but for people how to approach it, things to look out for, things to do, things not to do. It's been really golden. We always finish up with 3 questions. We always ask people the same 3 questions. So if you could meet anybody, living or dead, who would you meet if you got the opportunity?
I'm sure some of the people you've had on here have been quite profound. I'm sure the Queen and Winston Churchill.
See where this is going.
Yeah, it's not going down that route. I can assure you.
Is it Brian from the hardware store?
Yes.
For my sins, I am an Arsenal fan, and I have been for a long, long, long while, through thick and thin. We're very thin at the moment. It's particularly grim. But who I'd love to meet is living, and for me is a legend. Thierry Henry.
Oh, Thierry.
By far the best player I've seen.
Are you going to do the chant for us, David, that I am also being an Arsenal fan from the stands as we do? Or the seats now, they're not really the stands, are they?
Yeah. So from North Bank days to what was the North Bank equivalent at the Emirates, I will not be sharing the chant with you on here. But for me, he's by far the best player I've seen in an Arsenal shirt. He is a World Cup winner. From what I've heard, a really, really nice guy. I just love to sit down and have a beer with him. Just have a chat and reminisce about when we were good.
Hang on, let me see if he's in my phone. No, he's not.
and my second question is, if you could be a fly on the wall with somebody in a certain situation, who would you like to be a fly on the wall with? And I don't know if that's going to be another extension of an Arsenal thing or whether you've got something different.
No, I'm nothing if not predictable. No, it's an Arsenal thing as well.
Here we go.
Well, a couple of things. Two examples. One, I would like to go back to when Arsene Wenger was there. I do remember a particular game at Tottenham where we won the league. We won the league at White Hart Lane. It was a long time ago, I must admit, and I was in the crowd that day as well.
It probably wasn't quite as long as someone else winning the league, though.
Yeah, we may have mentioned Tottenham already, but I won't on here because there may be certain Tottenham fans listening. And our customers could be Tottenham fans, so I don't want to alienate them. But I would just love to know what Arsene Wenger was saying in that dressing room before that game, knowing that all we needed was a draw to win the league. Also, fast forward to now, I would also like to be on a fly in the wall with Mikel Arteta, going back to the game at the weekend. What on earth did he say to them to make them come out to play so damn rubbish? And they have been for most of this year as well.
We're going to have to rename this podcast Talk Sport or something like that. I've got one more question, but I'm kind of hesitant to ask it because I can feel another Arsenal extension coming. And the last question is, if you could swap any two people's jobs, who would you swap? So, for example, you could swap, Kanye West as president and turn Joe Biden into a rapper. Who would you swap round?
That would be quite funny, wouldn't it? I'd like to see that. But not quite football related. And this isn't, I'm going to try not to get political here, but I would love to swap the Prime Minister for Piers Morgan. Or if not Piers Morgan, anybody in the media. Now, this is regardless of who the Prime Minister is, I would add. This isn't a Boris rant or anything like that. Because personally, I think at the moment, the Prime Minister, whoever they are, has got a blooming impossible job. They're damned if they do, they're damned if they don't. And all they've got is the media throwing rockets at them all the time. And I'll use Piers Morgan as an example. He seems to be critical of absolutely anything he does, always sniping from the sidelines. And I'd love to see how good he is in that particular job. Yeah. On the plus side, he does have one redeeming feature to that, Piers Morgan.
Let me guess.
He's an Arsenal fan.
You there we go.
I thought I'll squeeze the football in at the end.
I think life generally, it's easy to commentate on anything, isn't it? When the decision rests with you and you have to live and die by those decisions. I think we're all a lot more thoughtful about those decisions when you're just commentating on things.
He didn't respond so well when they was put under pressure after that royal interview, was he? When he just left.
That when he walked off, wasn't it?
Can't really do that as the PM.
No. Yes. That's really interesting, David. Just quickly, how can people get in touch with you if they want to get in touch with you? What's the best way to do that?
A few ways. Probably the easiest, honestly. If you haven't got my details already, just go onto the internet, FTAfinance.co.uk. You'll track us down on there. All of our contact details are on there. Mobile number, landline, email address. You'll also find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. We're everywhere. Come and find us.
You don't sound like a difficult guy to find.
No, quite easy to find. I think if you Google David Brewer, my details will pop up. You'll also get the Lord Mayor of London as well. He also used to be called David Brewer, so don't click on his details. David Brewer Dental or David Brewer Finance. You should find me.
There you are. Lovely.
Brilliant.
Appreciate your time today, David. It's been really, really interesting.
Really useful.
And we'll catch up soon.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, gentlemen.
Cheers, David.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dentology, where we discuss the business of dentistry. If you like what you heard, please do subscribe where you found this episode. That would be amazing. And also follow us on Instagram.